that later in the program, but first to the Strait of Hormuz. John, since we chatted a week ago, Tehran has said that it is very close to an agreement with Oman regarding control of the strait. However, it stated that any deal to reopen the waterway will only happen if the US corrects its behavior and meets a long list of 6 specific demands. John, what's going on here?
Well, I think what's happened here, Tom, is that the Iranians understand very clearly that they're in the driver's seat, and the Americans have hardly any leverage at all. So the Iranians are driving a really hard deal. And the best way to illustrate this is to look at the terms of the 17 June Memorandum of Understanding that the United States walked away from, and compare that with what the Iranian demands are today. I think it's really stunning how much Iran is demanding now compared to what they were demanding on June 17th in the Memorandum of Understanding. And all of this just shows you how remarkably foolish Trump was not to reach a deal based on the June 17th memorandum. Now, let me explain what I'm talking about. In the June 17th memorandum, basically, we were interested in opening the straits. Both sides wanted to do away with their blockades, open the straits, and the Iranians asked and the Americans agreed to lift the oil sanctions, just the oil sanctions, so the Iranians could sell oil on open markets. The other thing that was in the 17 June memorandum was a ceasefire. And this included Lebanon, of course. But all of the other key issues were delayed. There was no demands from the Iranians that they then settle what I call the big three economic issues: the sanctions, the overall sanctions issue, the reparations issue, and the frozen assets issue. That was all delayed. Those key economic issues were going to be negotiated during this 60-day period that was laid out in the Memorandum of Understanding. Moreover, the nuclear issue was delayed as well. So once you got the ceasefire in place and you open the strait, then you would move to negotiating these big three economic issues, as I described them, plus the nuclear issue. Well, what's happened here today is that the Iranians have said the big three economic issues have to be solved on Iran's terms now before we'll open the straits. The reparations issue, they want settled before they open the strait. The overall sanctions issue, they want settled. And the frozen assets, they want settled. And there's no talk whatsoever about the nuclear issue, which is really quite remarkable. So for us to get the strait open at this point in time, we have to make all these concessions. We, meaning the Americans, have to make all these concessions on these big economic issues, not get the nuclear issue up front. This is disastrous. And it just shows you how remarkably foolish the United States has been. And by the way, if you want to take this a step further, if you go back to February 28th and the period before that, right, all we were doing at that point in time was negotiating on the nuclear issue, which is now apparently disappeared. And all these other issues, these economic issues, which play to Iran's advantage, of course, were not even on the table. So this just goes to show you how remarkably foolish the Trump administration has been and how much trouble we're in today.
Valley, John makes the point that Iran actually has more leverage today than it did when it signed the June 17th Memorandum of Understanding. What are your thoughts?
No, I fully agree. I mean, if you looked at it, Trump probably never really intended to implement that memorandum. That's actually the Iranian understanding, that he started cheating the minute that he signed it. First, he said ceasefire in Lebanon. Immediately, they brokered the deal between Lebanon and Israel, which now allows Israel to bomb Lebanon at the invitation of the Lebanese government, pretty much, trying to sideline any Iranians saying that. Secondly, there was a promise then of unfreezing at least some Iranian assets. They started with talking about 30 billion, then it went to 12 billion, went to 6 billion, went to 3 billion, and then zero was released. And then, when the Iranian belief is that actually the United States was encouraging countries to break Iran's hold over the Strait, telling them not to consult with Iran. The Strait is open, use channels that Iran cannot control. And Iran was put in a position that either it lets Saudi, Qatari tankers to go through, in which case then their hold on the Strait would de facto be over, or to try to stop it. And in fact, the Iranians cynically believe that perhaps Qatar and Saudi Arabia gave 2 tankers to the United States as a gift, basically to try the Iranians, which is soured their views about their neighbors. But the Iranians decided to shoot at those 2 tankers. And then Trump decided not to respond in a calibrated way that might restore the MOU, but actually use it as an excuse to go back to war. Now, you consider, as John said, that the United States has bombed Iran for a month systematically. It has not at all dented Iran's ability to close the Strait. Iran tightened the closure of the Strait, destroyed significant amount of infrastructure in Kuwait, literally forced the United States to abandon its military bases in the Gulf and actually move a lot of its material to Syria, Jordan, and Israel. Iran hit those targets in a way that surprised the United States, particularly in Syria and then barrages that went into Jordan. It looks like when the US went back to war with Iran, it was actually forced to move farther away from Iranian borders, move its war material farther away. A month into the bombing, the president threatened that, I'm going to destroy power plants, etc. The Iranians gave a list of all the power plants they would destroy in the Gulf. Will match escalation with escalation. He backed away from that. It's clear that the US doesn't have the munitions, either offensive munitions or defensive munitions, to keep bombing Iran. And as John says, so we went into this war for an additional month just for Iran to become stronger and our position to become weaker. And ultimately, what the Iranians are saying in this new proposal is, there is no more misunderstanding about control of the Strait. It's going to be in black and white. Black and white, it is going to be managed by Iran in collaboration with Oman. We will tell what ships go when, and there is no more misunderstanding. So we're going to tighten the language of Article 5 to Iran's advantage. And then we're not going to, wait for you to decide whether or not you want to give money or whether or not you want to lift sanctions. You have to do all of those now. And I think there's another element here, which is cumulative, in that Trump has created such distrust about himself with Iranians that actually it gives him even less leverage at the table than he had before. He walked away from a nuclear deal in 2018. He bombed Iranians twice in the middle of talking. Iranians went to Islamabad, immediately put a naval blockade on Iran. He signed an MOU and then undermined it and went back to war. And so, even the leverage that you might have, even if you accepted the Iranian terms, I'm not sure the Iranians would even be happy without having certain guarantees that he actually would implement.
You say the Iranians are fed up with Trump, but Trump stated just last week that Iran is being unbelievably duplicitous and that all they do is make me angry. John, Vali made it clear that Tehran views its control of the Strait of Hormuz as non-negotiable. Why would Trump ever accept an arrangement where Iran collects tolls and denies transit without its explicit permission?
It's very simple, Tom. He has no choice. He lost the war. This is a devastating defeat for the United States. Could you tell me what the United States should do to regain leverage over Iran? I actually think you can't tell me because we have no solution. We have no.
Well, Trump might think that because Oman is a U.S. ally, it shouldn't be cooperating with Tehran on this arrangement.
He does think that, but it doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. Trump has no cards here. It's as simple as that. I mean, first of all, he can't escalate which is his main threat, for two reasons. One, he's out of munitions, as Volley said. And number two, our Gulf allies have told him in no uncertain terms that that is unacceptable, because the Iranians have made it clear that if we escalate, they will escalate and they will destroy oil facilities, desalination plants, and so forth and so on in the 6 Gulf states. And they will effectively wreck those states. And Trump doesn't want to go down that road. He has no options here.
Could the United States simply accept that it lost the war and that Tehran controls the Strait of Hormuz, but refuse to pay reparations, grant sanctions relief, or unfreeze assets, essentially walking away?
Well, technically, yes, I would assume so. I mean, but that's basically accepting defeat very clearly. I mean, there is no way, I think, right now for Trump to come out of this to claim victory. I mean, there are multiple layers of defeat here. I mean, America's strategy with Iran is now a threat to our allies in the Gulf, not actually a security shield for them. Trump basically started a war that has destroyed their economies and has no way of protecting them. The U.S. military is now running out of ammunition, which has global implications with China and Russia. And Iran is holding him by the throat. I actually have to say that, the Omanis didn't go to the Iranians on their own. They went at the behest of the United States. Last time they tried to negotiate with Iran directly, which is a few months ago, the United States threatened Oman with both sanctions and military strikes. That's against an ally. And this time is very clear to the Iranians that the Omanis are not freelancing. They brought a proposal from Washington and they're carrying proposals back. And it's, I haven't seen the text of that proposal, but it's very clear that, what the Iranians are saying is basically you have to accept that you've lost this war. You have to guarantee that the war will not happen again. You have to accept that the containment of Iran is over. In other words, no more bases around us. You need to move your troops, and you need to even lift your economic containment of Iran, and basically accept Iran as a great power in the region. Now, I think the question for Iranians is that this is a humiliating defeat for Trump. And I think one of the war objectives for Iran now is that he would lose the midterm elections in a big way. They speak about this very openly, that would be a very marquee thing. But the other question, and John is better positioned to answer this, is can the United States, forget about Trump, accept such a defeat by a secondary power? And whether Iranians would calculate that, a year down the road, 2 years down the road, that that the U.S. would revisit what happened right now. And that's why I think the Iranians want to front load everything they can get. They don't want to wait now, because they actually don't trust that any kind of an end to this war would actually be stable. So they want the money, they want the reparations, they want the sanctions relief. They want some kind of a recognition of the fact that the U.S. won't be in the region. And then they could work with that to see what comes next.
John?
I agree completely. I think the Iranians know full well that regardless of who is in the White House, they can't trust the United States. A lot of this, by the way, has to do with the power of Israel and the Israel lobby in the United States. I mean, we talk about this being a humiliating defeat for the United States. I believe it's an even bigger defeat for Israel. They don't talk much about it publicly because they don't want to acknowledge the extent to which Iran has defeated not just the United States, but Israel. And the Israelis and the lobby in the United States, and therefore who's ever in the White House, will go to great lengths over time to undo any deal that's worked out now to get back at Iran. So the Iranians have a deep-seated interest in front-loading this agreement, as Volley said, and that's exactly what's going on. You want to understand here that Iran has two broad objectives. One is to change the balance of military power in the region, which means greatly weakening the U.S. military presence. And the second thing is to fix their economic situation, to do everything they can to get rid of sanctions, to get their frozen assets back, and actually to have this ability to exact tolls from ships passing through the Gulf, because that's a way of making money over time if the United States once again decides to play hardball on the economic front. So I think what the Iranians are doing from their point of view makes eminently good sense. If I were them, I would drive a really hard bargain up front. I argued when they signed the 17 June memorandum that the Iranians were foolish to do that. It was not tough enough. I think the Iranians were in the driver's seat. I think last year during the 12-day war, this is from June 13th to June 25th, 2025, when it finally ended, I thought the Iranians were foolish to agree to end it then. They should have kept playing hardball because I think they had the advantage over the United States and the Israelis back then. And the reason I think the Iranians, from their point of view, should play hardball is because you can't trust the United States and Israel as far as you can throw them.
John, speaking of the domestic fallout, did you see the recent Washington Post report about Trump's anger toward Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth regarding extreme munition shortages? What did you make of that?
I did see that piece. I find it hard to believe that Trump didn't understand we had a munitions problem. General Dan Kane, who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and who I believe has been a reasonable voice on this whole issue since the weeks before February 28th, was warning Trump that we had a limited number of munitions and that we had to be very careful about getting into a protracted war with the Iranians. And then we got into this 40-day air war. And one of the reasons that we ended the 40-day air war was not simply because we were not winning it, it's because we were running out of munitions. It's hard to believe that Trump didn't understand this, especially when you marry it to the fact that this is what Kane was telling him all along. I think what's going on here is that Trump is trying to blame Hegseth for the mess that we're in now. Of course, what Hegseth did was he blamed his deputy. He said that his deputy had not kept him informed and had not taken the necessary steps to rectify this situation. So I think what you're going to see moving forward is a giant blame game. And most interestingly, Tom and Valley, it will be very interesting to see how Trump and Netanyahu, or more generally, the United States and the Israelis, deal with each other moving forward, because it's very clear that the Israelis led the United States into this disaster.
And we should note that Ukraine is similarly running out of air defenses, leaving them increasingly exposed to Russian long-range strikes. Valley, your thoughts?
No, I agree. I think, if you thought that the cardinal mistake that Trump made was to say that this war will be only 3-4 days, which is also what Israel and Bibi Netanyahu told him. I mean, just a few days ago, Israel fired 2 senior intelligence officials on the fact that they got the regime change business in Iran wrong. So the blame game is also going down in Israel as well.
Wow.
But they sold this bill of goods to Trump that, you kill Khamenei, you do the bombing, the people will rise up. There could be a Kurdish incursion from Iraq into Iran, but all said this is going to be very short. Supposedly Trump was told about that they can close the Strait of Hormuz, and he said they won't have time to do it. They'll be gone by then, right? So if you start with that kind of a very simplistic view, then everything else follows. In other words, in the first 20 days of the war, the United States hit Iran with over 300 Tomahawk missiles. And the Pentagon had only budgeted 67 for the next fiscal year. Pete Hegseth bragged that we've hit 7,000 targets. I mean, 7,000 targets with extremely sophisticated, expensive, not easy to replace, missiles and bombs, and obviously to no effect. In other words, it didn't knock Iran out of the war. And every time Trump's instinct and Bibi's instinct is one more push, one more punch, and it will do the job. So let's go to another month of bombing. Let's do it one more time. That was even the logic behind Israel's going from the 12-day war to the 40-day war. They didn't get it done in June of that year. They didn't learn the lesson They just said one more push will do it. So I think, Trump has, and I think it's not just this war, because if you're China or Russia and you're looking at the fact that the United States, with all its military might, really cannot run a long war. It doesn't have the industrial capacity or to basically reproduce expensive weapons very rapidly. And the Iranians have discovered ways in which you can deplete those munitions through perseverance, using your geography, swarming targets with cheap drones and missiles. And I think that, in a way, even the consequences of this war for the United States in Asia, in Ukraine, elsewhere, is going to be a bit more long lasting than just whether he accepts the MOU or not.
Chief among President Trump's stated reasons for initiating this war was stopping Iran's nuclear program. Is it fair to say the conflict has successfully halted that program?
Tom, I want to make one quick point before I answer your question.
Yeah.
Just going back to why the 12-day war ended, I remember very well that two reasons were given. One is that the Israelis and the Americans were running out of defensive munitions to protect Israel against attacks from Iran. In other words, Iran's ballistic missiles and drones were beginning to overwhelm the defenses that the United States and Israel had in place during the 12-day war. So that was one reason we quit. The other reason we quit, and there were news reports about this, is that Trump was getting evidence or getting inklings that the Iranians were going to shut down the Strait of Hormuz. It's very important to understand that. So the threat of the Iranians shutting down the Strait of Hormuz was there during the 12-day war.
Well, why didn't he follow that? Why didn't he follow that logic in the lead up to February 28th this year?
Who knows? I mean, you want to remember that in the decision-making process that led to the attack on February 28th, J.D. Vance, John Ratcliffe, who's the head of the CIA, Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Marco Rubio all told them that attacking Iran on February 28th would be a very bad idea.
This is documented, by the way, in the book Regime Change by those New York Times journalists. Go on, John.
Yeah, and it's quite apparent that the two key individuals who convinced Trump to launch this cockamamie war was, number one, Benjamin Netanyahu, and number two, David Barnea, who was then the head of Mossad. And they told Trump that, a shock and awe campaign that had a decapitation strategy built into it would put an end to the regime in a couple days and we'd live happily ever after. This, of course, is ludicrous. And his principal advisors all understood that. But nevertheless, Trump decided that he would listen to Bibi Netanyahu and David Barnea. Well, that's the argument that they're going to make now. Remember I said at the top of the show, what's happening here is that the nuclear issue has more or less disappeared.
Exactly.
It's really quite remarkable.
It is, yeah.
Well, the nuclear issue has not disappeared at all. And after everything that's happened, and remember our emphasis on the lack of trust that exists in the present situation, the Iranians have a greater incentive than ever to acquire nuclear weapons. And the idea that they don't have the capability now to do that is not a serious argument. They can easily, in my opinion, reconstitute their nuclear program. They still have all that enriched uranium, enriched up to 60%, and it's easy to go from 60% to 90%. They could develop a bomb with relative ease. Okay. This is why we wanted to get rid of their nuclear enrichment program, which we have not done.
So the unintended consequence of this debacle is that Tehran really does have powerful incentives to develop nuclear weapons so that this sort of thing doesn't happen again. Vali, your thoughts on that? And also just generally, how long would it take for Iran to rebuild?
Well, that's now an intelligence guesstimate because we really don't know how much was destroyed, how easily can basically they rebuild their cascades and reconstitute the program, but I think we're not talking about a very long time. We were talking maybe a clock of 2 to maximum 5 years for them to not just be able to enrich and have fissile materials, but actually even to weaponize it and have sufficient number of warheads that would give them deterrence. But now we're in a position that they may not do that, provided the United States is willing to pay a very high price. In other words, if out of this current MOU, you're going to get the United States to agree to a longer ceasefire with Iran, move its troops out, potentially pay reparations, etc. Now, the only things that will make the Iranians listen is the U.S. giving them things, not demanding things. I mean, I think the period that you can basically pressure Iran into submission, even on technicalities of the nuclear issue, I think is gone. I think now the U.S. essentially will be asking them, what do you want to make this a non-issue, even if they were to accept it. And so we're seeing in these demands that Iran is now very comfortable demanding, and the United States is not comfortable demanding. So I think psychologically Washington hasn't got there, not just the White House, the political class in Washington, a lot of the journalists. I mean, this word that they continuously overuse, Iran is overplaying its hands. It's just more like what it means to me is that we cannot believe how much this picture has changed. There must be something unreal about this. But in reality, Iran is not overplaying its hands. It's just playing its hand. Well, first of all, let me say, I don't believe in this moderates versus hardliners. I think there is more division in Washington than there is in Tehran.
Okay.
Rubio, Vance and the dysfunctionality of decision-making in Washington is a lot more than Tehran. Every government ultimately has a debate over policy. But I think there is a consensus in Iran that they will not give up the strait. There is a consensus that they have managed the war very, very well. There is a consensus that they have defeated the superpower, or at least put it on its heels. What is there for them to debate about? Even this argument that now has become very popular in Washington, I think a lot of it is really disinformation that Mujtaba Khamenei is dead or he's not really in charge. What difference does it make? Whoever is in charge is running a tight ship. I mean, we're asking the wrong question here. So what if he's dead or alive? Doesn't make a difference. So no, I don't think they see themselves overplaying their hand. They think they have a narrow window to get the maximum amount of strategic advantage from having turned the table on the U.S. It would be unconscionable if they didn't press their advantage. The future generations, they think, will ask them, you had the U.S. on its back heel. This was the time for you to ask for more. And they would say that the U.S. has put blockade in Iran now twice, and the U.S. is the first to blink. They can suffer more than everybody else can. After 47 years of suffering, they can suffer more. And they ultimately think that the only way to a better place is through the path they're going. Now, I'm not going to sort of second guess whether they're overplaying their hand or not, but I think a country that in the past 6 months has managed to survive 2 nuclear-powered militaries going after it, the world's premier superpower, Middle East's most armed and technologically advanced military, and yet we're having this discussion. I think in humility, we have to think that maybe they've got it right. And actually the society, and I don't mean put it only on Trump, everybody else in Washington who's thought that the Iran policy and the way we've gone about it has been correct all along, that Israel is correct, that, that they obviously have got it wrong. So far, they've got it wrong. And ultimately, on the economic issue, Iran is suffering. But John said at the very beginning, they're asking for big economic gives. You have to pay for war reparations. You have to unfreeze up to $30 billion. Iran has reportedly up to $100 billion of frozen assets around the world. We want to trade and we want to sell oil to whoever we want, and you need to get out of the way. And once you lift the sanctions, we will be able to actually collect tolls more easily because we can actually receive the money. So short-term pain, long-term gain. That's the way they're seeing it.
Yeah, John, though, Pat Buchanan, the original America First Republican presidential candidate, both in 1992 and 1996. He once quipped that Congress was Israeli-occupied territory. Don't you need congressional support for sanctions relief? This is going to be very difficult for Trump to get Republicans especially, but also even some Democrats to support sanctions relief.
Well, I think there's no question that Congress will do everything it can to get in the way of sanctions relief. But there are a lot of things that Trump can do to deal with that issue. Congress has limited control on this issue. Trump has a lot of cards to play. And if the Congress refuses to go along with Trump and doesn't, fully lift the sanctions, the Iranians can compensate for that with tolls. But Tom, let me just make one point on this whole issue of Iran overplaying its hand. I agree with Bali completely. The idea that you're possibly overplaying your hand is in effect saying that the Iranians ought to be more moderate in their demands. And if they're more moderate in their demands, the Americans will be more reasonable. We can work out a modus vivendi here. Any Iranian who believes that is out of his mind. The idea that you can accommodate the United States and the United States will accommodate Iran is an argument that is belied by the historical record here. And Iranians fully understand that there's only one way to deal with the United States, and that's to play hardball, period. End of story. And if you start making concessions to the Americans, they'll take advantage of you. Just look at what happened with the 17 June Memorandum of Understanding. Do you need any more evidence that you can't trust the United States? I don't think so.
Yeah, the Iranian political system, Vali, and you've studied Iran in great detail. You're one of America's and the world's leading experts on Iran. Isn't it premised on a sort of hatred of the United States? And this is a point that a lot of the neoconservatives make. So, any reconciliation with Washington would threaten the foundations of its anti-Western ideology.
Well, yes, the Iranian Revolution started out being anti-American and is to some degree embedded in their thinking, but now it also has national security reasoning behind it. This is not cultural hatred after 40, 50 years. The United States actually, since the June 12-day war and the 40-day war up to this period, has shown itself to be a single greatest threat to Iran. I mean, the minds of the Islamic Republic, there is no distinction between regime and country. It's true that many Iranians may say the United States is only a threat to the Islamic Republic, but the